What is the proof that I am guilty of child abuse? In order to obtain a conviction under California Penal Code PC 273D, the prosecutor must prove the following, 2 facts known as elements of the crime. 1. That you willfully, intentionally, inflicted cruel or inhuman physical punishment, or an injury, on a child. 2. That the infliction of the punishment, or injury, resulted in a traumatic condition. So what does this actually mean? Willful means with a willingness to commit an act. As long as you intend the act, the consequences are irrelevant. As a result, if, for example, you grab your child's arm, and inadvertently, he falls and got hurt, grabbing the arm will be considered a willful act. Even though, cruel or inhuman is not defined in Penal Code 273D. Though, it is the critical point at issue. In any event, using common definitions taken from Webster's dictionary, cruel means disposed to inflict pain in a vindictive manner. Inhuman means lacking mercy, pity, kindness, or tenderness. Traumatic condition means a wound or internal or external injury to the child, whether of a minor or serious nature, caused by physical force. Although traumatic seems to imply dramatic, that's not the case. Even something as minor as a scratch qualifies as a traumatic condition. Unfortunately, there is really no clear-cut definition of what qualifies as child abuse under California Penal Code 273D. The circumstances surrounding the incident must be evaluated to determine whether the act constituted abuse. The prosecutor will make a similar evaluation. Less serious acts or injuries will likely be charged as misdemeanors, and more serious acts or injuries will be charged as felonies.
My daughter abused drugs during and after her pregnancy. When her daughter was born, she relinquished her to my care and returned to the streets. When my granddaughter was a little more than 2 years old, she fell down bruising and cutting her leg. Since it appeared to be a deep cut, requiring stitches, I took her to the hospital. While waiting for her to be released, a doctor requested that I step outside of the room. I saw a man go into her room, and a part of me knew exactly what was happening. I prayed that my grandchild would not say anything to cause them to take her from me. After waiting for what seemed like an eternity, they released her and told me that I could take her home. When I asked what had just happened, the doctor said that when children come into the emergency room with bruises, they must call social services. The man talking with my granddaughter was the agency worker from social services. Even though the doctor explained this to me, I felt that I was targeted because I am an ethnic minority. However, I was relieved that they recognized I had not abused my granddaughter, and we were able to go home together. Who can make a report to CPS about my child? Anyone who might suspect that your child is being abused or neglected may call CPS to report the suspicion. Each state or local community has its own 800 number and 24-hour hotline. Any member of the community, parents, or the child can call and make a report of suspected child abuse or neglect. Any person may voluntarily report suspected abuse or neglect. Persons who work with children and families are legally required to report suspected abuse or neglect. They are called mandated reporters. This includes professionals in healthcare, childcare, social services, education, mental health, law enforcement, guardians, and clergy, unless information is considered privileged. This list of mandated reporters may vary slightly from state to state. How does CPS respond to reports of suspected abuse and neglect? There is some level of response to every report. Intake is the first stage of the process. Reports are received at this point. The purpose of intake is to gather enough information from the person who makes the report to determine the following. If the reported information meets the legal and agency guidelines for abuse and neglect. If the person who is reporting seems believable. If the child has been harmed, or is at risk of harm. If the agency should respond. How quickly the agency should respond. If the agency decides that the report meets its guidelines for abuse or neglect, then an investigation will take place. 7 out of every 10 initial reports nationally are accepted for further investigation. If the suspected abuse or neglect is by a person who is not the caregiver, then the report may be sent to law enforcement, and the police may need to talk to you and your child. Are all abuse and neglect reports treated the same way? No. A number of states have adopted alternative ways for responding to CPS reports. When reports show that a child is in serious or immediate danger of harm, then an immediate investigation would take place. This is the investigation response. The investigation process is then followed. The agency worker, law enforcement, and the court may become involved in the process. What is alternative response? Alternative response is another response, often called an assessment. It is offered to families who are able to keep their children safely at home while receiving services. These families need help and voluntarily agree to participate in services. The services received are individualized to meet each family's needs. The court is not initially involved with families when this alternative response is used. If it becomes necessary to protect children, the court can become involved. States that offer alternative responses find that families do well, and that courts rarely become involved. How does the CPS decide which type of response method to use? In states where this alternative response system is available, the agency can choose how to respond. The choice is determined by the following: severity of the report, level of danger for the child, availability of the necessary formal and informal supports, willingness of the family to participate voluntarily in services and make the required changes. Here is another story of child abuse. "I thought only girls were raped," said Ken's mom. "I never imagined that anyone would touch my son Ken. He was only 6 years old, and I did not know that I had to protect him from that kind of harm. When I came home from work one day, my babysitter told me that my son had not come home from school. She said that she had called the school, and they told her someone from social services would call me. I picked up the phone and called them. Where is my son? They said someone would contact me. I sat at the phone waiting, imagining what had happened to my son. A few hours later, it felt like years, a man rang the doorbell and announced he was the agency worker from social services. I screamed at him, "Where is my son?" He asked if he could come in, so we could talk. I let him in the house, only to continue yelling, "Tell me where my son is. What have you done with him?" He explained that my son was at the district office because of allegations of sexual abuse. He asked me where my nephew was, and I told him he had not gotten home from school yet. He had football practice after school. He sat me down and explained that my son had complained to his teacher about pain in his bottom. His teacher sent him to the nurse, who called CPS because my son had said that my nephew had been playing back there. I became more hysterical, and said no way, my nephew would never touch a child, let alone my son. I had taken in my nephew Tom several years ago after my brother became addicted to cocaine. But I could not believe he would touch my son. He liked girls, and dated often. I explained all of this to the agency worker. He said that a full investigation was underway, including a physical examination of my son, but unless my nephew had somewhere else to live, my son would not be returned home because he would be in danger. My head started spinning. What if my son had made this up to get Tom in trouble? What if someone else had done this, and Ken was blaming Tom? Where is my son? I asked again. I wanted to talk to him and find out why he was saying this. The worker said that he was at the district office, but unless housing arrangements were made for Tom, my son would be placed in temporary foster care, until the investigation was concluded. They had to complete the physical examination. An expert in the field of sexual abuse would be performing it. I asked, "Can I go? Who is this doctor? Is my son scared? Who is with him? What am I going to do?" I finally found a good friend, which agreed to take Tom and make sure he got back and forth to school. The worker let the office know that my son could come home later that day, after Tom had gotten his things and was taken to my friend's home. The investigation took several months. During that time, I visited my nephew at the friend's home and provided for him there. My son remained at home with me and began trauma therapy. They discovered that it had not been Tom that had abused my son, but a neighbor down the street, who Ken was scared to tell on. Tom was returned home, but their relationship is still strained. The boys rarely speak to each other, and all of us are working it out during weekly sessions with the therapist. I believe one day we will all heal, but that day is nowhere in sight. Tom is hurt by the accusations, and no matter how often he is told that Ken accused him because he could trust him, he is angry and confused. Ken continues to work through what being sexually abused really means, and what parts it will play in his future.